morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. And thank you, Anders, for the introduction, as well as the opportunity to give this webinar. As the title here states, and has already been read, I'll be speaking on the validation of the Delta4 Phantom Plus MR for MR-guided radiotherapy, a comparison between the Delta4 Phantom Plus MR and the ArcCHECK-MR. Before I go any further, I'd like to state my disclosures. Parts of the work that I plan to present on today were directly supported by Scandidos. But to be clear, I myself am not an employee of Scandidos, nor do I have any vested financial interest in them. Here is a brief outline of the topics I'll be covering today. I'll start by providing some introduction to the subject matter, and then describe our experience using the Delta4 Phantom Plus MR, which, for brevity, I'll mainly be referring to as the Delta4 or Delta4 MR throughout this presentation. I'll start by talking about the calibration process, and then move on to describe our experience using the Delta4 MR on a conventional non-MR linear accelerator, followed by the selection of clinical plans used for validation, and then talk about the specific measurement setup on ViewRay. Finally, I'll describe the IMRT QA measurement results obtained using the Delta4 and compare them to historically measured results that were acquired using our institution's current MR-compatible solution, the ArcCHECK-MR. Most of us are well aware that there are many potential advantages to combining MR imaging into a radiotherapy treatment delivery system, including the ability to increase soft tissue contrast, being able to reliably adapt on the fly to patient-specific anatomical changes during each treatment fraction, and of course, doing all of this without increasing dose for the patient. As of today, there are two commercially available MR-linac solutions, namely the ViewRay Meridian Linear Accelerator, which includes a 0.35 Tesla split-bore magnet and a 6 MV linear accelerator, as well as the Elekta Unity, which includes a 1.5 Tesla closed-bore magnet and a 7 MV linear accelerator. At the University of Wisconsin-Madison, we presently use ViewRay and have been since it originally went live with Cobalt-60 back in 2014. The advantages of using an MR-guided linac are most apparent when treating, for example, challenging abdominal cases where the positions of patients' bowels may change frequently and must be accounted for prior to each fraction. The use of MR-linacs introduces an entirely new set of associated challenges as well. For one thing, it can be difficult to ensure that both the treatment delivery system and imaging system do not interfere with one another. The dosimetry of MR-linac treatments should explicitly account for the magnetic field effects, and the resources required to purchase and maintain an MR-linac can be vast from both a financial and a personnel perspective. Finally, radiation detector response can be affected by the presence of a magnetic field, and that's assuming that the radiation detectors themselves were even MR-safe detectors to begin with. Adapting radiation detectors to the presence of magnetic fields is often difficult from an engineering perspective, and newer versions of several existing radiation detectors are still actively being developed. So that brings us to the question of what kind of IMRT QA solutions currently exist for MR-linacs. And a cursory glance at the literature will show that a large number of recent articles have explored many of the same IMRT QA detectors that we're already used to seeing in the clinic, such as ionization chambers, diodes, scintillators, diamond detectors, film, and gel. And there are also groups looking towards measurement-free solutions such as log file analysis and Monte Carlo. Given the focus of this talk, however, I'll be mainly speaking about the diode array options pictured here, also keeping in mind that presently, only 2 of the 3 detectors pictured are currently commercially available. The Octavius unit is, interestingly, the only solution listed on ViewRay's own website as a partner product, but is presently listed as a work in progress. So for this webinar, I'll be focusing on the Delta4 MR as well as the ArcCHECK-MR. Speaking of the Delta4, I've shown a table here summarizing its main physical properties. We see that the Delta4 makes use of 1,069 P-type silicon diodes arranged in a crossed array pattern. The detectors themselves are nominally spaced 5 millimeters apart in the central 6 centimeter high resolution region and 10 millimeters apart elsewhere. But multiple measurements can also be combined and offset by 2.5 millimeters to effectively achieve a 2.5 millimeter resolution near the center. The array length and width are both 20 centimeters, and 2 measurements can be combined to measure extended fields larger than the 20 centimeter active region if required. So now what I'd like to do is go through our experience using the Delta4 MR, starting with the calibration of the unit. An absolute calibration for the Delta4 was performed in an identical fashion to that of a standard non-MR compatible Delta4 Phantom Plus unit. And by that I mean is an ionization chamber was inserted directly into the Phantom unit using a custom insert, and a series of reference fields were measured at different field sizes and gantry angles. ScanData software provides the following worksheet to help track those measurements, with nominal values inserted here as an example. So you can see that here, for a single energy, 6 MV in this case, that 4 representative measurements are required for an absolute calibration. For anyone that's been through the process of calibrating the older Delta4 models, which required a full disassembly of the unit, this calibration procedure is going to be significantly easier. And for anyone currently working with the non-MR compatible Delta4 Phantom Plus, the process will be essentially identical. The presence of the ViewRay magnetic field did not introduce any significant obstacles to the calibration process. So the first aspect of our evaluation was to investigate using the MR-compatible Delta4 with a non-MR-linac, specifically the TrueBeam STX. For the purposes of this test, we selected a few different plans treating different anatomical sites and included target sizes varying from roughly 2 centimeters in diameter all the way up to larger than 20 centimeters. The calibration process was performed in an identical fashion to the one that I just described, and the results of these measurements were compared to their original IMRT QA measurements, which were acquired using a different non-MR compatible Delta4 Plus unit. We found a very high level of consistency between the results measured using the MR-compatible Delta4 and the non-MR Delta4 Phantom Plus, as these tables indicate for the selected plans measured on the TrueBeam. So a major takeaway from these measurements is that the same MR-compatible Delta4 unit can be used in a multimodality institution where both MR and non-MR-linacs exist. Now, as scientists, and with only a relatively short amount of time to test drive the Delta4, we were very eager to put this device through its paces on our MR-linac. To that end, we selected 36 clinical SBRT plans spanning different anatomical sites of treatment, field sizes, and levels of plan complexity to measure using the Delta4. Ultimately, we landed on this distribution of plans that are shown here. Now, these plans have all been delivered previously, and their associated IMRT QA was measured in the past using an ArcCHECK-MR. At the time of the original measurements, our institution implemented a 3% 3 millimeter global gamma criterion with a 20% dose threshold. We required that 95% of points pass to consider a plan measurement suitable for treatment. In most cases on the ViewRay using ArcCHECK, we typically measured results greater than 97% with that criteria in place. So I want to explicitly mention that 3 of the plans we selected as part of our measurement gauntlet were specifically chosen because the ArcCHECK-MR measurements involved gamma pass rates less than 97%. It's worth noting that all 3 of these plans involving the lower gamma pass rates on ArcCHECK were adapted treatment plans, which involve small targets and high levels of modulation. Another consideration for which plan to select involved using different levels of plan complexity. We wanted to make sure that we attempted to measure a wide variety of composite field sizes and shapes. This box plot, for example, illustrates the distribution of one specific quantity, which is the plan perimeter, shown on the y-axis in units of centimeters. The plan perimeter metric was determined by analyzing MLC positions from the DICOM RT plan file header of each ViewRay plan and establishing the total perimeter of each individual control point. Then, an average plan perimeter was determined by weighting each control point by the total number of monitor units delivered through it and summing them up across the entire plan. Our process for readying the QA plans for measurement followed our typical clinical workflow. Using the ViewRay treatment planning system, QA plans were generated for each of the selected clinical plans. While planning, we did our best to ensure that high dose and low gradient regions were placed near the geometric center of the physical radiation detectors. We calculated all dose distributions with a magnetic field parameter set to on, a grid resolution of 2 millimeters, and an uncertainty set to 0.5%. The actual measurement, the physical detectors were set up to the room lasers and then shifted per the QA plan requirements. In the Delta4 software, measurement results at both 3% 3 millimeters as well as 2% 2 millimeter criteria were recorded for each plan. As far as the software experience goes, this screenshot I've shown here came directly from one of our measured clinical plans. Those familiar with the Delta4 software will be pleased to know that very little has had to change to accommodate this newer detector. We still have the measurements of each detector board shown side by side, along with additional information such as isodose lines and dose profiles readily available to the user. The view can be switched from absolute dose like I've shown here to this view showing the gamma pass rates, which can also be shown in real time during the actual measurement. Because of the step and shoot delivery nature of ViewRay, some of you may be wondering how the interface handles a plan like the one I've shown here, which is actually comprised of 24 individual beams. The good news is that the start button only has to be pressed a single time for the entire duration of the measurement, as opposed to needing to manually stop and start the beam stop and start the measurement between every single beam, like we're accustomed to doing on our C-arm linear accelerators. Generally speaking, our experience measuring patient-specific QA using the Delta4 software was almost identical to our previous experience using the standard non-MR compatible Delta4 Phantom Plus. And so we were able to successfully measure all 36 clinical QA plans without difficulty. So keeping all of that in mind, here are the results and comparison for gamma pass rates measured using both the Delta4 and ArcCHECK across all 36 plans investigated. Overall, the measured pass rates were similar between the two devices. Of course, the ArcCHECK results are based on historical QA measurements, whereas the Delta4 results were all taken in relatively rapid succession. There's a couple of things I want to draw your attention to on these plots before we get ahead of ourselves and jump to any conclusions. The first is that we can see here, based on the 3% 3mm plot on the left, that both devices involve similar measurement results for all 36 plans investigated. The three large exceptions you can see are the ArcCHECK measured plans, which I mentioned previously, and we already knew that those involved lower pass rates and also involved small and highly modulated dose distributions. So if I draw a line here with our clinical objectives, as shown, we can see that both devices mostly involve measured gamma pass rates well above our institution's IMRT QA criteria. The 2% 2mm results show more differences between the two devices, but I want to strongly emphasize that measured gamma pass rates are not suitable as a head-to-head comparison of these detectors in any meaningful way. Because of differences in machine output, detector response, measurement setup, and the user, it's really difficult to say which measurement, if either, is closer to the truth. So my goal in presenting this plot to you is to demonstrate a high level of consistency between both measurement devices and not to read into anything further than that. As an additional consideration, we also broke down the results based on the anatomical site of treatment to see if any group immediately jumped out at us as being different from the others. Based on the 3% 3mm results shown here, we didn't find that to be the case. And again, we can see large differences between several data points where I already mentioned the ArcCHECK measured lower than usual gamma pass rates. If we inspect one such plan more closely, we can see that this specific plan, shown here in the Delta4 software, involved a small target with a nominal diameter of about 3 centimeters and a volume between 7 and 9 cubic centimeters. Putting on the gamma pass rate view, we can see that the Delta4 measured and planned doses agreed well with each other for this specific difficult plan, whereas our ArcCHECK measured results indicated a larger discrepancy between the planned and measured doses. So with this device only having been released recently, I thought it would be important to conclude by comparing how our experience is related to at least one other group, since there isn't much literature out there yet on the performance of the Delta4 MR unit. Specifically, I wanted to describe how our experience related to the group at the Miami Cancer Institute based on their recent white paper. In terms of the calibration process, the absolute calibration using an ionization chamber is straightforward and effectively identical to the process that we're already familiar with and which was also described in the white paper. In terms of the planning, measuring, and software UI experience, we also found those to be consistent with our own previous experience, as well as the descriptions provided in the white paper. Now, it's difficult to make apples-to-apples comparisons with another group's clinical treatment plan results due to likely systematic differences in our planning and measurement workflow. But I believe that our clinical plan measurements using the Delta4 were consistent with the methodology that was reported in the white paper. And hopefully, as more time goes on, other users will also share their data so that more meaningful comparisons can be made. We investigated the consistency of this new Delta4 MR unit against both our legacy ArcCHECK-MR device, as well as our non-MR compatible Delta4 Phantom Plus unit, and we found that the Delta4 MR unit was consistent with both. Something we omitted in our validation of the device was a rigorous characterization of the Delta4 MR in terms of well-established quantities such as reproducibility, dose linearity, field size dependence, dose rate dependence, and angular dependence. Our investigation was more clinically focused, but for those who are interested in those quantities of the Delta4 MR, I would direct you to a paper by DeVries, where these parameters were studied in the presence of a 1.5 Tesla magnetic field using a prototype Delta4 MR unit. DeVries found the qualities that I just mentioned were extremely similar between both the MR and non-MR compatible Delta4 Phantom Plus models. In a somewhat similar fashion, we also found a high level of consistency between the MR and non-MR compatible Delta4 Phantom Plus units when measuring clinical plans on a variant TrueBeam. So in closing, I hope what I presented today might help some of you out there make a more informed decision about your next MR compatible patient-specific QA measurement device. I'm well aware that there's obviously a lot to consider and relatively little in the way of useful data out there for emerging technologies, so hopefully the results I presented today will help bridge that gap in knowledge. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and please, if you have any questions, feel free to ask them. Thank you.